So what are Hawking and what are these? There's a whole series of people, some of them called the New Atheists. I don't think Hawking is one of them, but what are they? What's one way of looking at what they're saying? Well, what they're saying is something like this. This is another way of thinking about it. And you're walking down a dark street one night, and you come to the lamppost, and you see this chap here looking around. He's looking for his keys. He's looking for his keys. So you say, what's going on? I lost my keys. So you look with him for a while under the lamppost, and you can't find it. At some point, you say, well, where did you lose it? He says, well, actually, I lost it down the end of the street. And they say to him, but why are you looking under the lamppost then? He says, well, the light is brighter here. Okay, this is an old joke. But and I think what's actually happening, what these people are saying, is science is a very bright light, and that's true. It shines with tremendous clarity, but it only shines on one small part of our world. And if you're going to look for the keys only there, if you're going to say the only place that you could possibly look for keys is there, the keys do not exist anywhere else, you might miss something that's really, really important. In fact, the way I think a lot of important things in life are, like the example I gave you of choosing a marriage partner, but many other examples could be made, are a little bit more like looking a little bit further away from that. You have to find the keys in areas that are not quite as bright. You can't use a scientific method to necessarily shine on them. But there may be other reliable ways of achieving that knowledge. So let's go back to this God question then. How do we think about the big God question? How do we think about whether there is a God or there is not a God? What's the methods that we could use? So again, I use my incredibly, I like to use as a foil, my colleague Richard Dawkins. I should just say that I use Richard Dawkins because he's such a clear communicator. I actually agree with him on a number of things. And one of the things I really agree with him on is that he's quite clearly says, this question about whether religion is true or not is a terribly important question. And you can't sit on the fence. You have to make up your mind whether it's true or whether it's false. Now, he and I completely agree that that's really important. And in fact, I think a lot of people don't think about it nearly as hard as they should. And he says people should think about it more hard. Now, his final conclusions are going to be very different from my final conclusions, but at least we both agree on this point. So I don't want to just use him only as a foil, but say I actually agree with him on some things. So he says this, should we believe in God? Isn't it a little bit like believing in unicorns? If you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, or tooth fairies, Thor, or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe in it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. And so what's happening here, this is a very common type of argumentation. The argumentation is the default option is that there is no God. And you have to prove that there is God. You have to find evidence for God before we believe in God. I should accept that there is a God. Just like you should prove evidence for the fact that there's a unicorn, or provide evidence for the fact that there are bacteria, or whatever other things, kind of things that we find evidence for. And I think evidence is really important, but the real question isn't, is that the right way of thinking about it? The real question is, what are the starting points? Are there other ways of obtaining knowledge? And Dawkins would say, well, you either can do this evidentialist, what we call evidentialist approach. You assume there is no God and you find evidence until you, just like you assume there's no unicorn until you find evidence for a unicorn. And the only other option is blind faith. The problem with the argument, if you think about it, is that when people talk about God, they're not talking about an object out there like a unicorn. They're talking about the source of all being. They're talking about the God who created the whole world. And why should our way of thinking about that be the same way that we think about something like whether there is a unicorn or not a unicorn? So really there's some, you can already see there's some problems with that analogy, even though that analogy at first sense seems to be very attractive. And Dawkins says, well, the issue is that faith is the other option, is really a great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, or even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And a lot of the kind of, I'm using him again as a foil, but the kind of arguments that he makes and some of his contemporaries make is, the best arguments are against faith. There's some weak arguments for faith. It's about similar to believing in a flying teapot or believing in a unicorn. And I just can't see why smart people would actually believe that way. And this is a common popular view that I find on campuses and on the streets and with my friends. Now, I just want to contrast that view with a view of a well-known atheist philosopher. This is Quentin Smith at Western Michigan University. He's editor of Philo. And about 10 years ago, he wrote an article called The Metaphilosophy of Naturalism, where he complains that the justification of most contemporary naturalist views is defeated by contemporary theist arguments. What he basically means is that if you take the best theist philosophers and put them together with the best naturalist philosophers, people who do not believe there is a God, then the arguments are better on the theist side at the moment. And that's a problem, isn't there? Because clearly theism is not true. So it's kind of a rallying cry to the troops. We need to come back and resharpen arguments because we're losing this battle. And no, that's one point of view. It's a point of view by quite a distinguished philosopher. And I'm just pointing out that here you see the difference between a professional discussion about the question of theism or not theism and the kind of popular discussion, which is what Richard Dawkins is engaged in. So what are the kinds of arguments that Smith is complaining about? What are the kind of arguments for the existence of God that he doesn't like and that he's using this article to complain about and saying that they have to do something about it? Well, I'm going to give you a simple, he's really talking about a movement in philosophy, people like Woltersdorf, Plantinga, Reformed epistemology. And I'm going to give you a very simple example of how that works. So how do we actually think about this question of God? Okay, is it like this? Is it like believing in a unicorn or a teapot? We have to find evidence for it. Until we find evidence, we assume the onus is on us to prove that there is a God. Or is that really the right way of thinking about it? Is it true that the onus is on those of us who do not believe in God to believe in a God, to posit a God, just the way the onus would be on us if we believed or posited that we're flying unicorns, pink unicorns, the analogy he uses. Well, I'm going to take a different example. I'm going to say, actually, this is from one of my great heroes, John Polkinghorne, a physicist at Cambridge. He said, if we are to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points, either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. So what is Polkinghorne saying? He said, actually, all of you have a choice how you start. You can either start by assuming there is a God, or you start by assuming there isn't a God. Those are the two options. And from then, you've got to look at the rest of the world and see what makes the most sense. So I would say the problem with this kind of evidentialist argumentation is not the arguments themselves, not the arguments for the evidence for or against God, but the question of how do you weigh, how do you assess that evidence. And so I'm going to use an analogy here that comes from David Mermin, a physicist at Cornell that I admire tremendously. And he would use this analogy for arguing for how science works in the face of some critique from science studies, from the social studies of science. And he said, you know what, one of the things you should remember about science is that science isn't all about one thing proving it and that's it, one strand of evidence. Many scientific arguments are like tapestries, okay? There's a whole series of threads that we bind together to make a strong argument or a weak argument. And those people of science will realize that's actually true. When you say, I believe in special relativity, you don't believe it because there's one measurement that does it. You believe it because there's a whole series of things that cohere. Not only the fact that you can see effects of it in gamma rays, etc., but also the fact that when you combine special relativity with quantum mechanics, you can explain the hyperfine splitting in the hydrogen atom. Those are the kinds of consistency things that make us believe in special relativity. In fact, that's what special relativity was. What in fact Merm was defending in his 1995 Physics Today article. And I'm going to say that's a very helpful way of thinking about these kinds of big God questions as well. What we should do is you start with either the brute fact of a God or the brute fact of nothing, either in the beginning God or in the beginning nothing. And starting from that point, let's look at, can we make a tapestry of the way the world is? Which of these two makes the most strong tapestry? Which makes the most sense? Let's look at a whole series of things and say what makes the most sense of it. Well, I would argue that a lot of our deep intuitive sense of morality, our ideas about the fundamental human rights, that fits a lot better if I start from the beginning. I assume that there is a God. If I look at that, then it makes more sense of that fact of the world, or that assumption I have about the world. I've argued already that the basis for modern science fits very nicely from the assumption that there is a divine will and purpose behind the world. It makes sense of the fact that we have things like uniformity and rationality, and that there might be something like a God. It's actually quite hard, I think, and I would challenge any ontological naturalist to make a first principles defense of something like uniformity or rationality. I think it's very hard to do, but it's pretty straightforward to do from within a Christian worldview. There's a whole series of questions like that, and so I think what you have to do is look at these things and see how well they weave together. So what I'm going to do in the next, say, 20 minutes is look at a few more things. I'm going to look at beauty. I'm going to look at beauty in science particularly, and I'm going to look at intelligibility, and I'm going to look at the fine-tuning of the universe. So I'm going to now take this point of view. I'm going to start from the assumption there is a God, the assumption there is no God, and try to see whether I can look at science and see which of these two starting assumptions makes the most sense. And at the end, then I can hopefully assess these tapestries and see which of these two is the most reasonable.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.